Features podcast. I am Laura Main and I'm here with my co-host.
Hello, this is Adrian Smith here. And thank you everybody for continuing to support the podcast so far. We hit our 100th follower on Twitter last week, so that's very exciting. So thank you to everybody for getting in touch with us through that. So today we are doing the film Shogun Assassin, and later on in the program we will have our guest Dr Jonathan Wroot from the University of Greenwich to come and share his experiences of that film and his projects with Japanese cinema with us.
Cool, looking forward to that.
Yes, and he will know much more about this film than we do.
So much more. I can't emphasize that enough.
Do we need a synopsis of the plot?
I will have a stab at explaining the plot of Shogun Assassin. It was released in 1980 and directed by Robert Huston. But directed is an interesting word here because it was essentially cut together from two films from the Lone Wolf and Cub series. So 12 minutes of the 12 minutes of the film from Lone Wolf and Cub Sword of Vengeance, and much of the rest of the film, I think, from Lone Wolf and Cub Baby Cart at the River Styx. So we've got this hybrid mashup exploitation film edited together, and there's a sort of, it was kind of rescored, re-narrated, it was kind of changed.
It's like a really early example of remix culture.
Yeah, kind of.
It's like a hip-hop film before hip-hop. It's really interesting, isn't it? That they just took the images and then completely replaced all of the sound, all of the music, the sound effects, the voices. The story is completely different as well. Have you seen either of the original films?
No, but I've been sort of looking into what the differences are between.
Yeah, there's a lot of plot difference. It's very simplified.
Well, I mean, let's start with the plot of Shogun Assassin. So, now it's a lot of it isn't really explained, but when the film starts, we meet our main protagonist, Ogami, who is he used to be the Shogun decapitator, so the assassin for the Shogun. And he has sort of, his wife has been murdered. We don't really find out why, but he's left parenting his young son, Diagoro. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Am I?
I don't know. Daigoro?
Daigoro.
Who knows?
So the film is told from Daigoro's point of view, which is an interesting difference, I think, from the films that this is cut from. So it's Daigoro, who is very young at the start of the film, maybe 2-3 years old. And it's a kind of, through this very sort of deadpan narration, he tells us about his father and this journey that they go on.
When I was little, my father was famous. He was the greatest samurai in the empire, and he was the Shogun's decapitator. He cut off the heads of 131 lords for the Shogun.
The sort of Ogami just basically wheels his kid around in an antique wooden cart and slays enemies as he goes.
Yeah, and that cart is brilliant. It's got knives that pop out the wheels, removable handles with blades. It's like the ultimate tricked out pushchair. It's great.
It's a kind of interesting aesthetic, seeing this guy who has very much the 1,000-yard stare of a new parent. Like the way he looks at you, the way he just walks determinedly, like he's just trying to get through the day. Yeah. He's not had any sleep. His hair is a mess. He's not bathed in 3 days. He's just getting through it. So yeah, he sort of traverses the land with his son in this cart and fends off attacks by the Shogun's sort of minions, I guess. So
Yeah, there's ninjas, lots of ninjas.
Yeah. So
ninjas everywhere.
And the attacks themselves are very, very violent. But they're beautiful. Like, it's just, I was struck by the beauty of this. I mean, it's very exploitation-y, but the beauty of these scenes where, you know, you've got a scene where Ogami splits someone's head in two with a sword, but it's like balletic and poetic.
Isn't that amazing, that bit?
Yeah, the way that there's a sort of poeticness to the way the blood spurts out of people's kind of arteries.
Yeah, it's like they've all got really high blood pressure. I mean, it just sprays out at such enormous speed and volume. I mean, I've never severed a major artery, so I don't know if blood really comes out that fast or that high. But it's pretty spectacular, the distance that the blood will travel in this film.
Yeah, and you never quite get used to it either.
No. Although, having said that, this is slightly off topic, but years ago, I was providing video equipment for filming an operation. And I had to go into the operating theatre to help set this stuff up. And it was an old Victorian, it was like a university hospital. Huge ceiling, maybe 10, 12 foot high. And one of the doctors pointed out to me that up on the ceiling was blood. Like somebody's blood had shot that high during an operation and hit the ceiling. So maybe this is not that far from the truth. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a chat about how far someone's blood actually shoots out of their neck when you try and decapitate them with a sword.
Or can people still stay standing up when their head's been cut off? That's another question this film poses.
It poses many questions. Yeah, the science of Shogun Assassin. The biology of Shogun Assassin.
Yeah.
Let's get a scientist on board to...
It is pretty amazing. That shot when he splits the guy's head in half, and you're just sort of standing there, he's standing there, the person is standing there, and then just slowly it opens up like two halves of a coconut. It's pretty amazing.
It's breathtaking. And there's so many of the scenes and the way they're choreographed made me think of the films of Tarantino, for example. Clearly he draws from, and if you like homage, he pays homage. I don't know. But he's clearly influenced by a lot of the violence in this film specifically.
I think it doesn't. I have to admit, I'm not that familiar with Kill Bill. I've only seen them once, and I'm not a really big fan. But at the end, isn't Shogun Assassin the film that she watches with her little kid?
Yeah.
They sit down together to watch a movie, and it's this one, I think.
Yeah, her kid requests it as a bedtime movie, which is just precious. Yeah.
Well, it's a heartwarming tale of a parent and their child.
But, I mean, this film, for the people I've mentioned it to, the response I've gotten has been, this was my introduction to Kung Fu cinema. This just watching this film for the first time was such a meaningful experience. And I think there are many filmmakers for whom that is the case. I think it has a very special place in not just cult film history, but, you know, film history. And it's got a very special place for fans and practitioners. Yeah,
and it's a film that I've been aware of for years, and I don't know why it took me this long to watch it. I think possibly I was inspired by watching The Mandalorian recently, because that draws very heavily on the image of the Lone Wolf and Cub. I mean, have you seen The Mandalorian? Do you know this?
Yeah, I haven't seen all of it, but I was reading about that. I mean, I'm not sure how far... I mean, I've read speculation that The Mandalorian seems to be borrowing from Lone Wolf and Cub.
Certainly the image of this lone warrior pushing along a young child in a pram, and he appears to be a kind of roaming shogun or assassin for hire there. But anyway, I think that's probably what reminded me, oh yes, I've always wanted to watch Lone Wolf and Cub. So that's why I finally watched those films, and then this one, because this was the film that everybody used to talk about that I remember. And of course it was also included, as far as I know, on one of the Video Nasty lists. So it got caught up in that debate, which is really funny because the original films, they're from 1972, I think. So they're like a good decade before the Video Nasty, most of the films on the Video Nasty list.
Mm.
But then because it was reissued in 1980 in this form, and it was shown in British cinemas as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it got an
not...
X certificate from the BBFC, I think in 1981, but it was slightly cut.
Yeah, oh right, okay. It was the video release that got into trouble, although from what I can tell, if you owned a copy, it could be seized, but you would not be put in jail. So it was on the Category 3 list, which meant it was too naughty for you, but just taking it away was your punishment, rather than jail time like some of the other lists.
So just taking away your toys instead of throwing you in jail.
Yeah, that whole thing.
Yeah.
I'm slightly too young to have seen any of the Video Nasties at the time, but I remember the newspaper headlines and being just intrigued. I wanted to see those films. It was a great advert for all those movies at the time, but
yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to grilling Jonathan on this, actually. But for anyone who's not aware, before 1984, before their Video Recording Act, the release of videos in the UK, as far as I'm aware, wasn't regulated. And that's why you got all this kind of, you had this sort of video nasty controversy around films that were released on VHS, which had not been past the censor. And so could basically, you got kind of loads of violent stuff and exploitation things. And a lot of stuff was sort of circulated by, bootlegged and circulated among fans as well. These were all films that were going to corrupt the nation's youth. Yeah, there was that whole kind of moral controversy at which Evil Dead was kind of central, kind of at the center. I know, Evil Dead, one of the funniest and silliest films, and somehow they believed it was going to corrupt all these children. I mean, Evil Dead, just now it seems so satirical and it seems so ridiculous. But if you compare a film like Evil Dead to everything that's around today, it doesn't seem particularly violent or nasty. But watching Shogun Assassin, I was thinking about what the reaction at the time would have been, because even today it is breathtakingly violent, but I mean that not in a bad way. I think it's it's incredible, but I can just imagine how that was. I would be interested to know how that was received at the time and how that was framed as part of that controversy. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of its relation to other Japanese films, I'm not an expert in that area, but I've seen several of these kind of samurai type movies, and this level of violence is similar to things like Lady Snowblood and films of that kind of era. The extreme, I think, particularly when they're based on manga, which is what this does come from, a manga originally, and I think the sort of operatic slow motion violence is a way of recreating on screen some of the way the violence was drawn on the page. So it's not just coming out of nowhere, but how it was received, how it was viewed in the 80s, other than by very gleeful fans who loved it, I don't know. But the reviews at the time, I did have a quick look, and they're mainly quite positive. The Monthly Film Bulletin called it skillfully dubbed, which they almost never say films were dubbed well. But they praised the dubbing that's created this new version of the film, and said that the whole thing, the sword play, although some of the narrative doesn't make a lot of sense, like you were saying before, but they said in the review that they say that things are handled with admirable vigor. So they were quite positive, and funny enough, in that review, there's no real mention of it being controversial with all the blood and everything like that. They call it ample. They say about ample bloodshed, but they don't say that as a bad thing. There's no kind of moral hand-wringing about the level of exploitation. Yeah, and I was looking at the Variety review, and again, it's they barely talk about the film except to list some of its production background and to say that it could possibly a possible attraction for cult audiences and mass audiences. That's pretty much all they say about the film, which is kind of surprising. Yeah, you would expect a lot more shock or horror or something, but maybe because it was Japanese and because it appears to be, it's kind of like a traditional historical type film, that
kind of distances the audience a little bit from the violence. Like if it was a gangster movie and this was all John Woo style gunplay, maybe there would be slightly more worries about the violence. But you know, not that many people are going to be able to go out and copy the kind of moves and swordplay and things that are here. So perhaps that adds a bit of distance. I don't know.
Well, you say that, Adrian, but you seem to be thinking about it earlier in the podcast.
True. Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. But this is a film with quite excellent exploitation credentials. So directed by Robert Huston and his partner David Weissman, who bought the rights for $50,000 from the American office of Toho Studios. And it was distributed by New World Pictures, Roger Corman's outfit, to predominantly to movie circuits in the United States, which I guess were more sort of cult, more sort of regional grindhouse kind of cinemas, and then sort of released on videotape. I think who released the videotape? Was Universal Home Video? Oh no, in the UK.
The UK was Vipco.
Vipco, yeah.
Yeah, who were well known for doing that in the video nasty kind of world at the time. I thought it was interesting, just going back to what you were saying about the variety thing. One thing that they pointed out, and this is something I've been talking to my students about recently, they say that the film has already opened in Detroit with best results in black-oriented houses. And that ties in with something that I've been reading about with martial arts cinema in America at the time, that it appealed predominantly to non-white audiences. There was a big audience for Bruce Lee films and Shaw Brothers films in predominantly black cinemas in the 70s.
Okay.
And one suggestion for that is that it's because Hollywood was not really making films about non-white heroes. You know, mostly Hollywood movies are white guys coming in and kicking butts and saving the day. And apart from blaxploitation, which didn't really last all that long, there was still a real lack of non-white heroes in film. And so it would seem that black audiences really latched on to Asian cinema because here you had films with non-white protagonists. So I don't know. That's something I've read. I don't know.
That's really
how
interesting.
true it is, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
That this ties in with that. One other thing you mentioned about Robert Huston and David Weissman, one thing I liked when I was looking this up is that David Weissman had worked for Andy Warhol and also Fellini in the past. Yeah.
Fellini,
and
what was that? What did he work on?
I think Weissman did the US poster for 8½.
Oh, right, okay.
8½, is that what it's called?
Uh-huh.
I'm rubbish at Fellini films. That one, anyway. But again, with this whole idea of it being a remix, of taking and reappropriating and turning something existing into a new piece of artwork is straight out of Andy Warhol's playbook.
Yeah.
And so I like the fact that this film, although it's a kind of exploitation grindhouse classic, it has its roots in pop art and this sort of 60s counterculture.
Wow, that is a bloody interesting point. And I was thinking about appropriation. Because this film is an appropriation for Western audiences of the Lone Wolf and Cub series. Like it's a mashup, a recut, and an appropriation. But then Shogun Assassin itself has been appropriated by filmmakers. I mentioned Tarantino, and it's got this kind of legacy in Western cinema history as well. So yeah, this idea of a text that has, based on an original, recut, appropriated, circulated, is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and the soundtrack has been used particularly, I believe it was created on a Moog synthesizer, which was quite popular in disco music at the time. But a lot of the dialogue from the film has popped up in particularly Wu-Tang Clan album. There's an album called Liquid Swords, and that features several lifts of dialogue straight from the film.
Do we have a clip for that?
I'll put one in here.
Yeah, that would work.
Oh, mad one, we see your trap. You can never escape your fate. Submit with honor to a duel with my son.
I agree.
I see you using an old style. I wondered where you'd learned it from. You know very well. It's yours too. Alright, the gun. Will you show me? Then what have you come for? You clear? Since you're so interested.
Yeah, so you can hear dialogue, the voiceover. There's even a bit in one of the tracks I was listening to earlier when the guy towards the end of the film gets his throat slit and he just has time to deliver a monologue about the sound it makes when the wind blows through a slit throat. They put all of that in. That's all on the album. I've had a really interesting interview with RZA, Ruzza, I've heard him called.
You've never
Anyway,
sounded more white guy than you do right now.
I
Adrian.
know, it's rubbish, isn't it? The producer and member of Wu-Tang Clan, there's a great interview with him on YouTube talking about his 10 favourite kung fu films that he has sampled in their records over the years. Obviously the name Wu-Tang Clan comes from a martial arts movie. In that clip, he talks about Shogun Assassin. I'll put a link to that in the show notes because that's really interesting. But the Wu-Tang Clan are very devoted to martial arts cinema. During lockdown, they created a website I'd found called 36 Cinema, and they are doing live viewings of martial arts films, and some of them are with live commentaries. So you can sign up on the website and then watch the film streaming with a commentary by one of the Wu-Tang Clan, or they even did Man from Hong Kong with the director Brian Trenchard Smith. So, not only are they using the films in their music, they're also promoting the films to their audience of fans, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, do you know if anyone's published on Shogun Assassin and that topic? The sort of appropriation of that text.
They should. I haven't looked, to be honest. I should have probably.
No, I
looked
did have a
before we
look, but I
started
couldn't
this.
find anything. So I just wondered
Okay.
your knowledge is more detailed than Google Scholar is definitely. So.
I think there's something in there.
Yeah,
Definitely,
well,
if you wanted to explore that, you could.
I mean, I wouldn't know where to begin. I'd be very kind of out of my depth on that one.
And the fact that I don't even know how to talk about Wu-Tang Clan properly means I am going to be out of my depth on that one as well, I think.
But Shogun Assassin, while thin on plot, is full of imagination and meaning, and it's aesthetically very beautiful. But just on that idea of not appropriation, but maybe adaptation, it's interesting to look at how Shogun Assassin differs from the original text, and I think one of the main ways it differs is the voiceover by the young boy, Daigoro. So the plot is kind of reimagined in Shogun Assassin, so that we don't really we lose a lot of stuff from the Lone Wolf and Cub films it was based on. So we don't find out who killed his wife. Apparently in the film it was recut from, there was a thing with a rival gang, which is not there anymore. It's just Ogami wandering the wilderness. But that narration, that lovely sort of deadpan narration by that child, which is sort of overlaying all the violence that is happening on screen, describing it for us, I just thought was really kind of really weird and odd, but kind of incredible.
And I thought what was interesting, I read somewhere, it could have just been on Wikipedia, so it might not be true. Or I think it might actually, no, I think I found another website. There's a website called shogun-assassin.com. I think I was on there. But they said that apparently they got in lip reading experts to help them to create new dialogue to match the lip movements. And that's why the dubbing is so good in this film. Because what they are talking about is very often completely different from what's in the original films. But they've managed to create new English dialogue. Some of it is a bit rubbish and kind of funny, but it fits really closely most of the time how the lips are moving. But also by using the voiceover, it means they can keep filling in story during those big lengthy passages where they're just walking and nothing's really happening.
I did wonder about that. I did wonder about the lip syncing, because it's the voice, the dubbing is almost perfectly matching the lips in places, and the narration really keeps it moving. It's really sort of a fast-paced film. I think part of that is due to how the narrator is describing events to us. Yeah,
and it's interesting that the focus on the son, and this idea, because children are very central to the original film as well. That the opening scene in the first Lone Wolf and Cub, it starts with a guy beheading a child. That's what happens before the credits in the first film.
Starting strong.
It's pretty brutal. Yeah, exactly. It kind of grabs you by the throat right at the beginning, because he's the executioner for the Shogun, so he has to kill whoever the Shogun says has to be killed, and if that's a small child, because this child is going to grow up to be a rival to the clan, then so be it. So that's what he does. He's just an obedient executioner for the Shogun, but then stuff starts to go wrong and the Shogun orders his execution, and that's where the wife gets killed and so on and so on. But in the original films, the child, I don't think ever speaks, is not given all that much to do, particularly in the first film. The second film he has more to do, because he actually gets to get out of the pram a couple of times, and at one point he saves his dad's life. But the child is kind of blank for most of the time in the original two films. And he's just there to remind us that this is a good guy because he's looking after his son. Even though he was prepared to kill his son quite near the beginning.
Well, he was, he offers his son the choice between a sword and a ball. And if the son chooses the toy, the sort of ball, very brightly coloured ball, then he joins his mother in heaven. If he chooses the sword, then he joins his father on his quest of vengeance.
And he does that. I think he explains it more in the original film why he decides to do that, because it's going to be a very dangerous road that he's going on, and obviously people are trying to kill him all the time. So does his child really need to grow up in that kind of life? But because he can't make the decision himself, he makes the child decide it in the most stupid way possible.
That's great parenting.
Yeah, but thankfully, because we've already seen him kill a kid as well, which adds more
not in Shogun
drama.
Assassin, right?
Well, no, but in Lone Wolf and Cub, we've already seen him behead a child, so this is not impossible that he might do the same again.
Well, I mean, he seems to care about his son in Shogun Assassin, but he's also pretty ambivalent in moments as well. So he's prepared to let his son die if it means that he continues on his quest.
Yeah.
So
because they're already on the path to hell, basically. His son and him are treading this path, and if he dies now or dies later, doesn't really matter, because they're all on this path together. That's kind of his attitude.
Isn't another key difference between Lone Wolf and Cub and Shogun the romantic storyline with the Supreme Ninja?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure I would call it romantic.
Well, it's kind of, I think it's
version.
hinted at. So when Ogami is,
Possibly,
the Supreme Ninja is sent to kill him by the Shogun, isn't she? And she ends up, they end up sort of developing something akin to, maybe not a relationship, but an understanding.
I love the sequence when, because she's sent her highly trained lady ninjas, I think they're called in the film. She says, my female ninjas or my lady ninjas will kill him. But anyway, he's made short work of all of her ninjas. So then she comes to take him on herself. And there's that brilliantly weird moment where she jumps up. She jumps out of her clothes and then runs backwards into the distance, and it just keeps cutting back to his face and then back to her, and she's much further away, and then back to him, and then back to her again, and she's even further away. And it kind of reminded me of that moment in Monty Python and the Holy Grail with John Cleese running towards the castle from really far away. It kind
of is like a rewind version of that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really weird.
Maybe when when she gets to the end of her run, she just looks at the camera and goes, "It's."
Yeah, exactly. It is really funny, that bit. But yeah, I suppose in this version, she follows him and she's going to kill him, but there's less. Because I think in the original films, we see a bit more fighting between them first on the ship or in the water. She tries to kill him whilst they're fleeing from a shipwreck, and then he saves her. And I think in this version, they get to the saving her much more quickly. And then obviously the moment in the hut where little Daigoro starts to learn the difference between men and women. That
is another very strange scene. So the Supreme Ninja, they fight, and Ogami, the Supreme Ninja, and Daigoro are drying off their clothes in a hut, right? And there is a scene which looks like it's going to be a rape scene where Ogami grabs the ninja and she struggles. And then we find out that he's taking off her clothes so that they can all huddle together.
There's no fire. We must warm ourselves or die.
How can you save me?
You're trembling. More afraid of peace than war?
They're sort of embracing each other, the ninja and Ogami, around the body of Daigoro, and there's close-ups on his dad's nipples and then the Supreme Ninja's breasts, and then the kid is just like twanging their nipples, and then we go to a close-up of the Supreme Ninja who's about to grab her sword, but then the kid twangs her nipples and she somehow decides that she's not going to kill Ogami and his son. But then, of course, what is not kind of maybe apparent is that when Ogami and Daigoro leave the hut, the Supreme Ninja's going to have to go back to the Shogun and kill herself because she hasn't carried out her mission, right?
She should have just joined them. I don't know why she didn't just join them on their quest. That would have been quite fun to just team up for the next few films.
And jump out of her outfit whenever she needed a distraction, just like kind of...
Yeah. It's brilliant, isn't it? It's like an octopus suddenly fleeing the scene and leaving a cloud of ink behind. She's gone and just leaving her clothes standing, or it's like a Looney Tunes cartoon.
I've never seen this in live action. I've never seen it before in my life.
That's brilliant. Which I suppose again does go back to the fact that this is a manga, that they're incorporating things that work perhaps better on a comic page than would in real life, but we buy into it because it feels like it's all part of this world. If blood can spray 20 feet, then why not have somebody jump out of their clothes?
So this was for both of us, this was the first time we've watched this film.
Yes.
So I'm interested in what your reaction was.
Well, I had seen, so I just bought there's a Criterion box set that's got all the films in, which I bought last year. So I'd already watched the first two before I then watched this one. So I came to it the other way around. Most people in the UK certainly would have seen Shogun Assassin first and then seen the proper films later. So I kind of did it backwards. But I really loved the original films are fabulous, and I'm looking forward to working my way through the rest of the set. So I found this one mostly quite funny because of how compressed it is of the two films. I mean, apart from the flashback as to how the wife gets killed and all of that stuff, we miss out pretty much the whole of the first film, and there's loads of great stuff that happens in that one, and obviously lots of amazing fighting and all that sort of thing. So I was mostly quite amused by the Americanness of the voices and the kid's voice and the disco music, which seems so out of keeping with this sort of traditional period Japanese drama. And so I really enjoyed it, and I was trying to picture myself watching this 30 years ago and how much it would have blown my mind then.
I think it would have, yeah. I mean, you would have built your taste around this. It would have been such a formative experience. I feel sad that you missed out on that.
Well, yeah, I can see why this has been a formative film for so many people, definitely, and I wish that I'd had that opportunity, but I didn't. But one thing I was very aware of, because I suggested this film for the podcast before I even watched it, just because I knew that it would be fun. I hoped. But I was really worried about what you were going to think of it.
Why? Why were you worried about what I was going to think?
I was convinced you were going to hate me for this film.
Why?
Because either you can think this is amazing, or there's the potential to think this is the stupidest film I've ever seen. And
you say that, Adrian.
It could go either way.
You say that, Adrian, as though I don't routinely watch the most stupid films.
No, that's true. That is true. No. Please don't take that as a judgment on you. I was just worried that it could go either way. I
really liked it. I was blown away, actually. I appreciated the sort of poetic violence of it. Like it doesn't seem to matter even if you remember the plot, which I have trouble with recalling how it all fits together at this time. But I mean, it's the individual scenes and the individual sort of fight scenes are just so beautiful, and there are certain shots as well. Like there is this shot where Digoro and Ogami are sitting looking at each other, and then we have this circular pan which goes on forever and ever. We just spin around and round for no reason, no apparent reason. But there are lots of really cool aesthetic choices like that throughout the film, which just, I mean, I was watching it thinking, I rarely see stuff like this, or, you know, I've never seen something like that. It's really sort of interesting and challenging. And off the back of recently watching a whole load of quite by the numbers old rank comedies in British films, it was a breath of fresh air, to be honest, to be able to focus on something that is really imaginative. I mean, no shade towards the comedies I was watching, but it's a very different kind of thing. It's a very different kind of aesthetic.
Yes.
And there's no repressed British people making double entendres about sex. So that was a nice difference too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. When you compare that with our previous sort of stiff upper-lipped Brits, it's very different. Yeah, and he's an interesting character, isn't he? Our lone wolf. He's just so dry.
He just stares straight ahead. He just goes for it. He has no change of expression. He doesn't really have any expressions. He's just utterly kind of focused on what he's doing, which is why I said I made that crack about having the face of a new parent, like the stare of I've not slept for a week. He certainly has that.
Yeah. Well, and when I used to be pushing my kids around in the buggy, the most I could hope for was a cup holder. I would have loved to have had
you would have liked to have blades in your antique
tricks.
pram.
Yeah.
There is a great moment where in one of the fight scenes, Ogami just pushes the cart with Digoro on it into a bunch of ninjas. And then Digoro puts his tiny little baby foot on a pedal, and then blades shoot out of the cart and just like cut off the legs of the ninjas as he goes past. And he's just like, yeah, I did that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is funny with these films is just like people slice like they're made of cake. It's like there are no bones in any of these people. I'm sure it can't be that easy to just lop through a leg. Like, surely bone's pretty hard, right?
we're back to considering whether or not what would it look like if we just like randomly hacked and slashed a bunch of people.
Yeah,
it's a very different kind of podcast that we're getting into.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's probably best not go there. But it's not. It's violence, but it's not.
It's not realistic violence.
It's not realistic to the point of making you feel sick with what's going on.
When cut across the neck, a sound like wailing winter winds is heard, they say. I'd always hoped to cut someone like that someday, to hear that sound. But to have it happen to my own neck is ridiculous.
And now I'm very happy to welcome our guest for this week, Dr. Jonathan Wroot, Program Leader in Film Studies at the University of Greenwich and something of an expert in Japanese cinema, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, I would say there are other experts out there, but yes, I've studied that for many years, and I'm very, very happy for you to mention that label. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Laura, as well. Thank you both for inviting me.
Do you remember the first time you watched Shogun Assassin, and what was your reaction?
Yeah, that takes me back actually to, I wondered if I'd have a chance to mention it, the various DVD releases of this film that have been over the years. I mean, I was talking to Adrian earlier about this. I'm too young, unfortunately. I say in a way because, you know, being born just after this period, the video nasties era is kind of seen as this shiny nostalgic time of notorious exploitative films coming out, and this was one of the examples of films being like this being prosecuted just through the title and cover art alone. So I don't remember ever seeing this title on VHS, but when the restrictions started to ease, of course, in the 2000s around the video nasties and other prohibited films, I do remember this film and the others in the Lone Wolf and Cub series getting released on DVD. So I think I picked up, I was going to say the 2000s, but I don't think it was until the 2010s that I did pick up the whole Lone Wolf and Cub series, first on the Arts Magic DVDs. And then I don't think it was until the Eureka release, which I've forgotten the exact date for, they also released it with Shogun Assassin. And I don't think I'd given Shogun Assassin too much attention at that time because I'd heard the notorious story around it. You know, it's the first two Lone Wolf and Cub films edited together into one film, given a new soundtrack and everything. And at the time when I'd got into Japanese cinema, was through, actually linking to my current research at the moment on Zatōichi. A lot of this focused on Takeshi Kitano because he remade the Zatōichi films in 2003, and I was getting into his earlier gangster films and kind of films that he was winning awards at film festivals. So that was when I was an undergraduate in the 2000s. And so I'd heard a lot about Shogun Assassin at that time, and I'd probably given it a bit of a snobbish view at the time because it was two films cut together, given a new soundtrack, and I'm like, well, surely you just want to see the original films. And then picking up the Eureka DVD release made me realize, you know, that it should be appreciated alongside these other films, because if it wasn't for the popularity of Shogun Assassin, then we wouldn't have become aware of the earlier, original Lone Wolf and Cub films. And that reputation just seems to be further cemented now by the fact that they're all part of Criterion now as well. So I guess a lot of my familiarity with the films is kind of, handily or nerdily, you might say, because I've spoken so much about DVD in my research, is charted by those DVD releases.
And I can see your point, coming across this film and it being a recut version of earlier films. But actually, having watched it, for kind of the first time recently, actually, I think maybe it is different enough to be considered as a standalone product, because that kind of narration, the way that the plot is kind of almost entirely it's almost kind of changed by that narration. The fact that we have this kind of storyline, this romantic storyline as well between our protagonist and the Supreme Ninja. It stands alone. And I think actually I asked about your experience of watching this for the first time because I get the sense that for a lot of people this was their introduction to Japanese cinema, Shogun Assassin, and that was their introduction to Lone Wolf and Cub as well.
Yeah, it very much was, of course, in the year that it was first released, of course, first in the USA, and then eventually it would have made it to, I imagine, cinemas in Soho, maybe some other areas around the UK. And yeah, very much in 1980s. This is coming after lots of texts now which are famed for their cultural appropriation of Asia. Shogun Assassin also comes out in the same year as Shogun, the adaptation of the very famous book as well. So that's popular on TV. That also introduces American audiences and UK audiences to Toshiro Mifune handily as well. Might have been his first introduction to that actor rather than through Kurosawa's very famous films. So yeah, just putting that word in front of the title, because originally they were going to go with just something like Assassin or something else. I can't remember the exact story that Tom Mes tells. in his great book on these films, the Lone Wolf and Cub films, Father, Son, Sword, it's called. Sorry, I'm going to plug that because I'm
No, that's good.
referring to that a lot today.
That's good.
He mentions that they put that's kind of one of the reasons that they put that word shogun in the title, is so it's a bit of a marketing ploy, because everyone's kind of taken with that book in the 1980s, especially in America, and leading to the TV adaptation.
I mean, that's classic exploitation marketing there, isn't it? Just change your title to whatever's going to sell the best. And if shogun is a word, even if nobody really knows what a shogun is, stick it on there anyway, and you've got recognition. That's
one of the interesting
sense.
things that happens with the recut of Shogun Assassin, with the plot as it is. The shogun is portrayed as the bad guy, the kind of scraggly-haired villain that's constantly pursuing. How he's titled in Shogun Assassin is Lone Wolf. Of course, the character's actual name is from the original films is and the manga before it as well. These films are an adaptation of a manga. The character's name is meant to be Ogami Ito, but they just call him Lone Wolf for the sake of ease. And they retitled the villain as the actual shogun, when in fact he's like the shogun's, wouldn't say henchman, but kind of conniving advisor.
I'm sure isn't there a point in Shogun Assassin where they refer to him as a wizard? I seem to remember wizard coming up.
Yeah.
I remember watching, thinking,
right,
hang
actually.
on, yeah, that's changing things quite dramatically.
Well, they might have taken inspiration from some of the later Lone Wolf and Cub films, where it does get a bit mystical and some supernatural forces come in. But in these first two films, I think it just gets as crazy as the weapons that the assassin has had towards the end of the film. One of the ways in which I did become familiar with this film, first of all, was reading about it at my undergraduate university studies. But you've just reminded me, before that, we used to have on Channel 5, maybe Channel 4, very late at night, clip shows of weird and wonderful films and TV shows from around the world. I forget exactly the name of the one that was on. It was either Channel 5 or Channel 4, but they would often show clips from Lone Wolf and Cub films, just showing how ridiculous the fight scenes would get, with the various weapons drawn from the pram. And then they'd even show clips from the later Lone Wolf and Cub films, where it gets even more ridiculous, and Ogami Ito suddenly has a machine gun in the pram.
No, you're right. There was a show hosted by Emily Booth, I think it was on Channel 5, that showed clips from kind of really strange, and lots of sort of Argento films and things which in this country at the time we weren't that well aware of. Maybe the only other person doing shows like that was Jonathan Ross at that time.
And it's another example of cultural appropriation that you were mentioning earlier, how these things are pointed out as weird and wonderful, and you may not have seen before, especially at the time. This is like late 90s, early 2000s. They might not have quite made their way onto DVD yet.
This was around the time as well of the Tartan Asian Extreme label, which as distribution is your area. That must be something you've looked at in some detail. Although Shogun Assassin wasn't part of that. Those were more recent films. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah. As I said, I think the Arts Magic box set that I mentioned a little while ago, that came out in the early 2000s. I don't think that officially had Shogun Assassin as part of it. It wasn't until the Eureka box set. But and then in the early 2000s, in fact, starting 2001, 2002, around that time, the Asia Extreme label is established. But no, Shogun Assassin isn't caught up in that. It's the much more recent, more contemporary Asia Extreme films that helped to establish that label for Tartan. Their first big hit, and they start getting the idea to establish that label, is first of all with, I think it's Battle Royale, and then very quickly after that, I may have this order slightly wrong though, almost around the same time, if not shortly afterwards, they released Hideo Nakata's Ring and Takashi Miike's Audition. And those three titles really helped to cement the Tartan Asia Extreme label.
Is there a danger, and again, even going back to Shogun Assassin nearly 20 years earlier, one of the risks of labeling these films as Asian Extreme is that you're introducing a sort of element of Orientalism here, and that again, we spoke before about cultural appropriation. What's your take on the kind of issue of people in the West taking these Japanese films or Hong Kong films or whatever they were and going, oh, this is amazing because it's so crazy? And I don't know, is there a kind of danger in how we're viewing those films when they're removed to a greater degree from their origin, from their country of origin?
Yeah, I think there are both advantages and disadvantages to this. The disadvantages to this do lead to the notions of Orientalism that you've mentioned in cultural appropriation, which has been critiqued and commented on by several other academic researchers like Jamie Sexton and Oliver Dew in particular. I know has written a great article on this. I forget the exact title, but Oliver Dew has written on the fact that he makes a very good point about these films being taken over to the USA and UK and becoming popular and part of labels like Asia Extreme. It actually tells us more about the British audience, the international audience for these films, and shows that, you know, we're the ones desperate to lap this stuff up and consume this. So it tells us a lot about that. There is also the danger of Asia just being stereotyped and countries like Japan being stereotyped as weird, wonderful. So yeah, that is a really good point. Also, in addition to that, I would say that these films continue to be celebrated and re-released now, and that's really important in themselves, because it shows the market for these films that still exists. Kind of still showing Oliver Dew's point. You know, these aren't just with the Tartany Asia Extreme label now, because that's defunct. These have been picked up by other labels like Arrow, and of course Criterion has picked up some of these titles, including the Lone Wolf and Cub films and Shogun Assassin now. So they're part of like established, almost elitist, some people would say, labels regarding the film canon and preserving film history. And if those titles continue becoming popular, then some of the labels get a bit braver with releasing both older titles from these countries, from Japan, Hong Kong, China, and other territories, both from years gone by, as well as contemporary titles, to kind of show people, you know, you might love these films that have come out, been out for a few decades now, but there's other films that we can show you from these countries.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it as an issue of like Shogun Assassin is an appropriation of this series of films, and then it's in turn been appropriated by filmmakers in the West like Quentin Tarantino. But then we can also think of this as a kind of point of access. Like there is an issue of appropriation and maybe kind of issues around Orientalism, but there is also a gateway into, via this sort of Western package of these, these texts, there is a way into Japanese cinema. And for many people, that might be also kind of a point of entry. I was also thinking kind of just in general, really broad strokes ways about the sort of transnational, transglobal porousness between East Asian cinema and Hollywood cinema and the West. So we can kind of think about kind of Godzilla or, you know, stuff like Kurosawa and Star Wars and Seven Samurai and all of these things, how those boundaries have often been quite porous over history. So maybe there are issues of appropriation, and there are also issues of kind of cross-cultural communication and things like that to consider.
Most definitely. I think those are all really good points to make in terms of, you know, the similarities that you can find across that transnationalness and cultural communication and porousness that you mentioned, as well as important differences to still be mindful of. You've reminded me of the point I wanted to mention earlier, which is curious about how the Asia Extreme boom started. I'll just briefly go back quickly and cover this. A lot of the Asian horror films and kind of extreme films, because they weren't always horrors, sometimes they were gangster films or fitting into other genres, that became popular in the UK and were sometimes nabbed by labels like Tartan and the other imitators that came up, like Cine Asia and other DVD labels. A lot of these films wouldn't initially be that popular in Japan, or if they had been popular, you know, they'd be made as very low budget and were easy for the labels to pick up and distribute in other countries around the world, like UK, USA, and in Europe, mainland Europe. A lot of these titles got released as well. So just going back to that point earlier, as like Asia being stereotyped as this weird and wonderful nation where these films are extremely popular, it wasn't always the case. Actually, these films sometimes became more popular through their international reputation rather than at their own domestic box office. So sorry, I was gone back a few steps there, but going back to Laura's great points that she just made about, you know, the porousness between East Asia and Hollywood. Hugely mindful to be, a hugely appropriate point to be mindful of, because yes, you can see exactly that by looking at the history and impact of Shogun Assassin. We've talked about the release in 1980 with the very, popular TV adaptation of Shogun, but Shogun Assassin itself, and then slowly, you know, in the years following that, as they would first be, I imagine the history would go that they would be bootlegged. I'm pretty sure I've read about this as well, so I'm pretty sure this is the history. The original films would be bootlegged on VHS, first of all in America, and then make their way around to other countries, leading to, as we said, this get caught up in the video nasty phenomenon, eventually later making it way into DVD. Of course, before the VHS, they might have officially got a Grindhouse cinema release or something. So they're very slowly being seen by more and more people, and slowly the text gets like referenced and homaged in bigger budget features. So I'm sure we can all probably think of where we've seen this similar story.
The Mandalorian. Apparently, the Mandalorian is very Lone Wolf and Cub.
Yeah. Jon Favreau admits that in one of the making of documentaries on Disney Plus. So you can find Disney saying it in all its glory that yes, we're inspired by Kurosawa. Yes, we're inspired by Lone Wolf and Cub. So that's one of the many examples. Tom Mes, again, in his great book on this subject, also mentions that this inspired many Hollywood stories like Road to Perdition. That was started off as a graphic novel, very much as the original Lone Wolf and Cub saga did in Japan, by Kazuo Koike, who also did the manga for Lady Snowblood and Crying Freeman, which have been adapted into films as well. So his Lone Wolf and Cub manga, first of all, inspired the graphic novel Road to Perdition, which is, of course, the basis of the Tom Hanks film.
Cool. So, Jonathan, do you mind telling us a bit about Zatōichi and how you got interested in writing this book?
Yes, I'm very, very happy to talk about that because, again, I'm glad to say that
very happy to plug
Shogun
that.
Assassin. Yes. Very happy well, I am and I'm not. I mean, it's not out yet, and I will happily come back on the show and tell you when it is out. But that's ongoing at the moment. But there are some great links that I can make to Shogun Assassin as well, because as you've already established, this is the editing. Shogun Assassin is the editing together and re-soundtracking in both dialogue and music of the first two Lone Wolf and Cub films, Sword of Vengeance and Baby Cart at the River Styx. And that whole 6-film series was produced not just by, I think he was an executive or co-producer, the star himself, Tomisaburo Wakayama, but the main producer for these films was Wakayama's brother, who's Shintaro Katsu, who is the original Zatōichi. He played, Shintaro Katsu played Zatōichi in 25 films from 1962 to 1973.
I mean, that's an impressive run.
It is, yeah.
It gets even more impressive. I'm not finished yet.
25 films in 11 years.
Yeah, 25 films. Then he came back. I'll just quickly mention now, he came back in 1989 for a comeback film, which didn't quite work for him. But before that, he'd played the character from 1974 to 79 on TV in 100 episodes as well. So after the film series kind of dries up in 1973, that's the last film release he has as the character. He decides to just take the character onto TV for 100 episodes and manages to make that work up until 1979. Then as I said, he had the brief attempt at a comeback in 1989, which sadly didn't work out for him. That's what he's primarily known for in Japan. You stop someone. This might happen less so these days because of the popularity of the Takeshi Kitano remake. But apparently the name Shintaro Katsu is still well remembered around many areas of Japan. You mention that name to someone, they'll probably say Zatōichi or Ichi-san.
I know, I have to admit, I've never seen any of the Zatōichi films, but it's interesting that they're made by the same company. How do they compare in terms of the violence, which is obviously what Shogun Assassin and the Lone Wolf films are particularly known for, is this operatic blood spraying everywhere kind of stuff. Were the Zatōichi films like that as well, or was it a different style?
They became like that. They didn't start off that way. It's interesting how the Lone Wolf and Cub films fit into almost parallel with the later history of the Zatōichi franchise, because they're also impressive themselves. Lone Wolf and Cub, they're released very quickly in the space of 1972 to 1974. These 6 films all come out. And they abruptly finish because apparently the story that Tom Mes tells is the story is so popular, the manga in Japan, that there's talks of a TV adaptation, because TV is becoming the next big thing in 1970s Japan. And that's why Katsu takes Zatōichi over to television as well. So there's rumblings of that starting to happen with Lone Wolf and Cub, and they may take also Wakayama's portrayal over to TV if you want to do. But apparently he was unhappy with those ideas, and an idea was even floated that someone else might play Ogami Ito on the TV screen rather than Wakayama. And one story goes, no one's exactly sure why the series suddenly ends, because it ends incompletely with these 6 films. But Wakayama very suddenly stopped wanting to play the character, and some people suggest, especially the people that Tom Mez has spoken to, this is because Wakayama was unhappy about a TV adaptation. The films themselves released very quickly from 1972 to 1974. The Zatōichi films are still going by that time, and the Zatōichi films at that time have become more bloody and more exploitative. There's even a really interesting one which Katsu himself directs. He never directs any of the Lone Wolf and Cub films. He's just a producer. But he does start to direct more of the Zatōichi films and more of the TV episodes when that's established. Zatōichi in Peril in 1972. I'm really doubting myself. I've been writing a book on this. You'd think I'd remember all this. I'm pretty sure.
I have terrible recall. Even when I've spent years reading through a subject and I still get the dates wrong because I'm just in the moment. My brain just refuses to cooperate.
Yeah, Desperation. Sorry, that's it. I'll get the title right now. So yes, I have similar problems, Laura, even though I've been writing a book on this, trying to remember all the Japanese names as well. So Shintaro Katsu directs Zatōichi in Desperation in 1972, and that's particularly noteworthy for suddenly becoming quite more bloody and exploitative. I mean, at one point, Ichi is even tortured by the bad guys before he eventually, as happens in all these films, he vanquishes the villains and saves the day. But he's tricked by a prostitute into sleeping with her, so that he can be kidnapped by the Yakuza and then tortured. It gets all of a sudden very bloody and exploitative compared to the earlier entries, which were kind of more family-oriented entertainment. Even going back to the very start of the franchise in 1962, this series made Katsu a star, and the first film is trying to act as a star vehicle for him to show his acting skills, basically. But he's not seen that way by the studio at Daiei at a time. But all of a sudden, this almost overnight success with the first Zatōichi film changes that, and they decide to keep it going as a franchise. But you can tell that was an unintended consequence, because the first film is actually a much more somber affair, where Zatōichi is very reluctant to draw his sword and get involved in this Yakuza conflict, because he happens to know one of the Yakuza, and he's asking him as a friendly favor to help in this conflict with a rival clan. He's very reluctant to draw his sword. It's kind of a rumination on, the pointlessness of violence. But then Daiei were surprised suddenly by the success of this film. Maybe there were more readers of the original short story than they intended. It was 1948 that this character actually turned up in a story, and some of that author's other works have been adapted, and then someone got the idea in 1962 to adapt this into a story for Daiei. So Daiei is suddenly surprised by this success and wants to turn it into a franchise and see if they can make Katsu into a star, which they did. It was in the same year, 1962, the second film, the tale, imaginarily titled "The Tale of Zatōichi Continues," comes out, and it's very much more action orientated. All of a sudden, you have so many of the tropes in Zatōichi being established, like him being surrounded by a circle of villains with their swords drawn, and him having to fighting them all. Funnily enough, in that first sequel, his brother does turn up as well. He regularly turns up, also in one of the TV episodes as well, as a villain. And he does so in the second film, Zatōichi Continues. And then as the series slowly gets more popular for Daiei, as many samurai films do throughout the 1960s, but at the end of the 60s to the 70s, the Yakuza film, the modern day Yakuza film, very different to older examples of the Yakuza film, very much popularized by Kinji Fukusaku's Battles Without Honor or Humanity, if you've heard of them. That suddenly becomes very popular at the Japanese box office. And so the Shambara films, the kind of samurai films as we know them here, but they're known as sword action or Shambara films in Japan, are competing with this other popular genre being made by lots of studios. So they think they have to up the ante by adding in more gore, sex, and violence. So that's the reason why the Zatōichi films kind of turn that way in the 70s, became more exploitative with their violence. And Shintaro Katsu also decides, this is surely what the people want. I'll produce the Lone Wolf and Cub films. And not only that, he also releases a trilogy of films, Hanzo the Razor, which is very much about just sex and violence. Adrian's smiling like he's maybe heard of those films.
No, but I want to see them, just based on the name. That's great.
You'll probably enjoy the premise as well, Adrian, if you've not heard of these films before. It's Shintaro Katsu again playing Hanzo the Razor himself in these films. He plays a kind of Japanese medieval, or late medieval, I would say, because this is happening in the 1800s, policeman. And he has a way of getting information from female suspects that is unique to him alone. How it's politely put is he trains his penis to be as strong as possible.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
So he can pleasure women into giving them the information that he wants.
Now I'm regretting expressing an interest.
I think it sounds amazing. I'm going to watch that.
So what I find really surprising about those films and the later Zatōichi ones, as well as Lone Wolf and Cub films, they're released by Toho, who's one of the biggest. This is still the state today. They're one of the biggest Japanese film studios out there. They're responsible for so many of Kurosawa's films and the Godzilla films, and yet in the 1970s as well, they're trying to keep the film, the cinema audience coming back to see their films at the cinema by releasing also loads of these exploitative films in the 1970s.
I mean, like, there is a sort of British cinema in the 1970s was really exploitative, and there is a film series about a man who either gets a penis transplant. Yeah, he gets a penis transplant, and then his penis like gets him into trouble. So literally, this is happening in British cinema at the level of exploitation in mainstream cinema in the 70s.
Percy's Progress.
Oh God, yeah, it's terrible. But of course, there's no violence or amazing balletic, operatic, beautiful kind of like fight scenes. It's just all a bit shit. But
there is,
you know,
I mean, if we're going to continue in that vein, there's a blaxploitation film called Welcome Home, Brother Charles, about a Vietnam vet with a killer penis.
Oh God!
Wow.
We're getting into films about people with amazing penises.
We want to move away from that rather quickly. So, just coming back to Zatōichi, how did that fare with Western distribution? Were Western audiences seeing these films in the 60s and 70s, or did that come later as well?
I've heard some small stories about sometimes some of the Zatōichi films, maybe the first one. The only evidence I have this, I didn't get hold of it sadly, but I saw a film poster once up for sale on eBay where it had all been translated to English and suggesting this film was going to be shown somewhere like Cannes or some other international film festival, the first Zatōichi film. So it may have got briefly some showings there. Some of the earlier Zatōichi films may have been shown at the, stereotypical grindhouse cinemas, especially in the 1970s, but I haven't got that much evidence of that. What I believe has happened now, especially to the state where at the moment, Zatōichi again has been taken in by the Criterion label. First, it was released on Region 1 in 2013, and then it was about 5 or 6 years later. It gets released in Region 2 as well. This wonderfully, elaborately designed. I absolutely love it. Even my partner loves it. I imagine how we've slowly got to that point where this has been taken in by the Criterion label is that I would say that films like Shogun Assassin, and then the later releases on home video and DVD of like the Lone Wolf and Cub films, and around that time in the 2000s, I think you've got the first BFI releases of Kurosawa's films. Alongside all of that, you get people becoming aware of Zatōichi, I imagine, because of the production context links. People learning, it's the same people involved that also made these Zatōichi films, some of which some people may have heard of because there's crossover films in the Zatōichi franchise, like Zatōichi meets Yojimbo, and he does fight Toshiro Mifune.
Oh, okay.
And there's also Zatōichi meets the One-Armed Swordsman, who's a popular Hong Kong character. And so people will be familiar with some of these titles, and then there becomes an impetus to see all of these films.
Right.
So, Jonathan, how common was it for an American company, like an indie exploitation company, to take films, like Japanese films, and cut them together and release them? Like, was this something that people did, or was it, something unusual?
It seems to be something unusual because Tom Mayers actually has a lot of praise for what David Weissman and Robert Houston did for Shogun Assassin in the 90s. And he's not the only one, actually. I found a lot of appreciation now for this film, looking back nostalgically on this, how people came across this perhaps at a very young age and actually have a lot of appreciation for this. at the time. It seems to be quite unusual because a lot of care was put into this adaptation and this redub of the film, and even giving it its own soundtrack. I've heard of other cases, I'm sure you're aware of this as well, where this has been done with early European films, particularly the films of Ingmar Bergman, being recut and re-released at American cinemas. This particularly happens, I think, with Summer with Monica.
Yeah, that's true. It's a bit more slapdash. Like, I know lots of, like, the market for second features, B movies, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There's lots of instances of distributors taking films, buying cheap films, cheap American programmers, cutting them together, releasing them as a feature film in Europe, or vice versa. So yeah, that does happen. But you're right in that it does seem like there's such a level of care over this, and it's almost it's not an adaptation, but it feels like it's a meaningful recut, if you like. It adds more meaning to the film. It almost kind of exists as a standalone film. So yeah, I've never seen anything kind of quite like that. I've seen people chucking stuff together just to make a cheap buck at, a specialist cinema. But this seems to be a cut above, really.
Yeah, and it didn't seem to happen really again since. Tom Mes does briefly mention that some other American filmmakers, it wasn't Weissman in Houston again, but some other American filmmakers tried to do the same again with redubbing Baby Cart to Hades, which I think is the third or fourth film in the series, and retitling that Lightning Swords of Death as a sequel, and they thought they could have the same success again, which they didn't. Surprise, surprise. But the poster is very much going off the Bruce Lee phenomenon of the time. Tom Mes has a picture of it in his book where they say, raise a kung fu fist against Ogami and he'll chop it off. So showing that they're trying to exploit the Bruce Lee films very much for the marketing of this film.
And again, that sort of goes back a little bit to what we were saying before about the sort of Orientalist approach, where it doesn't matter that one of those is from China and one is Japan. Yeah. It's all the same. It's basically what they're saying.
Yeah, it just seems like those distributors haven't paid as much attention as Houston and Weissman did. And what you see happen since is that there have been some quite lazy redubs and subtitling of both Hong Kong and Japanese films, and maybe films from other East Asian countries as well, that first make their way onto VHS and then DVD quickly when DVD takes off in the late 90s and early 2000s. Happening for a theatrical release for a film, I guess the closest comparison I can think of at the moment is when The Raid was given a new soundtrack for its global theatrical release. Okay. I've still not come across Gareth Evans's film with the original Indonesian music soundtrack, but by the time I think it was Sony picked this up for global distribution, they got Mike Shinoda involved from Linkin Park to do the music, and that really helped with the marketing of the film.
It's not the same thing, but a few weeks ago I was teaching on Studio Ghibli, and we were thinking about how those films are redubbed for American audiences, not recut, but how that label Ghibli becomes something different when it's kind of distributed with different voice actors and different dubbing in America and in Europe and in Britain.
Yeah, some of those happened much later for their either re-releases at cinemas or their Blu-ray releases. Like, I think it's one of the older Ghibli films was kind of remarketed on the basis of the voice cast when they got Daisy Ridley involved. Very recently, it's got to be in the last 3 or 4 years with Daisy Ridley in the title role. So yeah, that's an interesting trend.
I guess I wish it was different. But a wish is only a wish.
Thank you everyone for listening, and thanks to our guest, Dr. Jonathan Wroot, for coming along and talking us through some really interesting facts and stories around the release of this film. If you want to get in contact with us, you can do so via Twitter. Our handle is @secondfeatures. And you can also send us an email. I keep forgetting our email address. Adrian, what is it again? secondfeaturespod@gmail.com. secondfeaturespod@gmail.com. Thank you. So yeah, thanks also to you, Adrian, as my co-host.
Thank you.
For some interesting chat. I think we did well considering that we'd seen this film for the first time only a couple of weeks ago.
And we've proved how good we are at
blagging.
bluffing our way through.
Blagging our way through.
I've built a career on it.
Oh God, don't say that. People might believe you.
Okay, thanks everybody. See you again soon for
a bit of feminist slasher film.
Bye.
Bye.